truth was just beginning.
December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. Dawn breaks cold and gray over snow-covered pines, and the air tastes of metal and frost. A young grenadier from the 12th SS Panzer Division crouches behind a shattered oak, his breath misting in short, nervous bursts. He grips his carabiner 98K, bolt action, 5 rounds, reliable as the sunrise. He's been told the Americans are soft, poorly trained, their equipment inferior. Then the first shot cracks the silence. Not one shot, not the methodical crack-pause crack of a bolt rifle. A rapid hammering rhythm. Bang, 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 bang. 8 rounds in less than 10 seconds, each one punching through the frozen air with mechanical precision. The grenadier flinches. Another burst follows from a different direction, then another. The forest erupts into a storm of semi-automatic fire, and he realizes with cold, creeping horror that the Americans aren't reloading. They're not working bolts. They're just shooting. Somewhere in the chaos, an American GI ejects an empty en bloc clip with a metallic ping, slams in a fresh one, and keeps firing. The Wehrmacht had refused to believe it was real. Now, the M1 Garand was unleashing hell. In 1939, when the German Wehrmacht rolled into Poland with devastating speed and precision, the world watched a new kind of warfare unfold. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry moving in deadly coordination. But beneath the roar of Stukas and the clank of panzer treads, the backbone of every army remained the same as it had been for decades: the infantryman and his rifle. And in 1939, that rifle was almost always bolt action. The German soldier carried the carabiner 98 Kurz, the Kar 98K, a refined descendant of the Gewehr 98 that had served the Kaiser's armies in the trenches of the First World War. It was accurate, rugged, and reliable. 5 rounds in an internal magazine, a smooth bolt throw, effective out to 500 meters in trained hands. The British had the Lee Enfield No. 4, a 10-round repeater known for its fast bolt and dependability. The Soviets fielded the Mosin Nagant, a brutally simple rifle that could survive the mud of Stalingrad and the cold of the Eastern Front. The Japanese had the Arisaka, the Italians the Carcano. Every major power in the war relied on the same fundamental technology: one shot, work the bolt; one shot, work the bolt. It was a rhythm as old as modern warfare itself, and it worked. For clearing trenches, holding defensive lines, and equipping millions of men, the bolt-action rifle was proven, cost-effective, and sufficient. But sufficient is not superior. Across the Atlantic, the United States was rearming. Slowly at first, America in the late 1930s was still clinging to isolationism, still scarred by the Great War, still wary of foreign entanglements. But within the halls of the War Department and the workshops of Springfield Armory, a quiet revolution was underway. A revolution led by a soft-spoken Canadian-born engineer named John Cantius Garand. Garand had been working on semi-automatic rifle designs since the 1920s. The U.S. military had long recognized the theoretical advantage of a self-loading rifle, one that used the energy of a fired cartridge to automatically chamber the next round. No manual bolt. No interruption in the shooter's sight picture. Just pull the trigger, and the rifle does the rest. Faster follow-up shots, greater sustained firepower, a single rifleman who could do the work of 2 or 3. But theory and practice are separated by engineering nightmares. Early semi-automatic designs were plagued by problems. They jammed, they overheated, they were too heavy, too complex, too expensive to mass produce. The French had experimented with the RSC 1917 during World War I, a gas-operated rifle that was clumsy and unreliable. The Soviets tried the AVS-36 and later the SVT-40, semi-automatics that worked in ideal conditions but failed catastrophically in the freezing mud of the Eastern Front. Most armies concluded that semi-automatic rifles were a luxury, not a necessity. Interesting on paper, impractical in war. John Garand thought differently. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, he refined his design with obsessive precision. Gas-operated, rotating bolt. An 8-round en bloc clip that fed from the top and ejected automatically when empty. Simple enough to be manufactured on a large scale, rugged enough to survive the chaos of combat, accurate enough to satisfy the marksmanship traditions of the U.S. military. In January 1936, after years of trials, modifications, and bureaucratic battles, the U.S. Army officially adopted the M1 Garand as its standard service rifle. It was a historic decision. For the first time in modern military history, a major power had chosen a semi-automatic rifle, not as a specialist weapon, not as a luxury for elite units, but as the standard infantry arm for every soldier. But adoption and deployment are two very different things. By 1939, only a fraction of the U.S. Army had been equipped with the M1. Production was slow. There were still shortages. Many units continued to train with the Springfield 1903, the bolt-action rifle that had served American doughboys in World War I. There was skepticism within the ranks, old-timers who trusted the simplicity of a bolt gun, who worried that a semi-automatic would waste ammunition, that soldiers would spray bullets instead of taking careful aimed shots. And then in December 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor shattered American isolationism. Within days, the United States was fully committed to a two-ocean war. Factories retooled. Production lines roared to life. And the M1 Garand, once a slow-rolling curiosity, became a matter of national survival. Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms ramped up production. By 1943, M1s were flowing to training camps, embarkation ports, and frontline units at a rate of thousands per week. American soldiers were about to carry a weapon unlike anything their enemies had ever faced in large numbers. In November 1942, American forces launched Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. It was the first major offensive deployment of U.S. ground troops in the European theater, and for many young GIs, it was their first taste of combat. They waded ashore in Morocco and Algeria with M1 Garand slung over their shoulders, uniforms still smelling of stateside supply depots, boots not yet broken in by desert sand. The Germans were waiting. By late 1942, the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel had been fighting in the North African desert for nearly 2 years. They were hardened, experienced, and confident. They had faced the British Eighth Army across the sands of Libya and Egypt. They knew the Lee Enfield. They knew its rate of fire, its range, its limitations. They had adapted their tactics accordingly, suppress the enemy with MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, maneuver with speed, and rely on disciplined rifle fire to hold ground. But the Americans were different. In the early skirmishes around Kasserine Pass in February 1943, German infantrymen began reporting something unusual. American rifle fire was faster, much faster. At first, some commanders dismissed it as exaggeration, greenhorn troops panicking and wasting ammunition, but the reports kept coming. Squads pinned down by what sounded like automatic weapons, only to later discover they had been facing ordinary riflemen. Defensive positions overrun not by machine gun teams, but by infantry sections laying down suppressive fire that rivaled light automatics. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Tunisia began to note a disturbing pattern. American infantry squads could generate a volume of fire that German squads simply couldn't match. A German Gruppe, typically 10 men, was built around a single MG-34 or MG-42 machine gun. That machine gun was the source of the squad's firepower. The riflemen with their Kar-98s were there to protect the gunner, to provide security, to take careful shots when needed. But the doctrine was clear. The machine gun suppresses, the riflemen support. An American rifle squad, by contrast, had 8 men with M1 Garands. 8 semi-automatic rifles, each capable of delivering aimed fire as fast as a trained soldier could pull the trigger. Even without their Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, which served as the squad's light machine gun, an American squad could put more rounds downrange, faster, than a German squad relying on bolt-action Kar-98Ks. The math was brutal. A German rifleman with a Kar-98K could fire perhaps 10 to 15 aimed shots per minute if he was well trained and working the bolt smoothly. An American with an M1 Garand could fire 30 to 40 aimed shots per minute without breaking a sweat. Multiply that across an 8-man squad, and the difference wasn't marginal. It was exponential. German platoon and company commanders began adjusting their tactics. They relied more heavily on machine guns. They avoided prolonged firefights with American infantry at close to medium range. They used terrain more defensively, hoping to force the Americans into kill zones where MG-42s could dominate. But adaptability has limits. You can change tactics. You can't change the fact that your enemy can shoot faster than you can. And it wasn't just the rate of fire. The M1 Garand was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. The sound of it, sharp, rhythmic, relentless, created an auditory battlefield presence that unnerved even veteran troops. German soldiers were accustomed to the distinct crack of the Kar 98K, the steady thump-thump-thump of an MG-42, the occasional burst from a British Bren gun. They could identify weapons by sound, gauge threats, and react accordingly. But the M1 was something else. It didn't sound like a machine gun. It was too measured, too precise. But it didn't sound like a bolt-action rifle either. It was faster, more aggressive, more persistent. In the chaos of combat, where survival often depended on split-second recognition of threats, the M1 Garand introduced an element of confusion. How many Americans are shooting? Are those rifles or automatics? How close are they? Uncertainty breeds fear, and fear in war is as deadly as any bullet. By mid-1943, as American forces pushed through Sicily and prepared for the invasion of mainland Italy, the M1 Garand had become standard issue across nearly all frontline infantry units. The 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, carried them ashore at Gela. The 82nd and 101st Airborne jumped into Sicily with them strapped to their legs. The 3rd Infantry Division climbed the mountains of southern Italy with Garands on their backs, and everywhere they went, the Wehrmacht learned the same hard lesson. The bolt-action rifle, for all its reliability and tradition, was being outclassed, not by tanks, not by artillery, not by air superiority, but by a simple, elegant piece of engineering that allowed an American infantryman to shoot twice as fast, with the same accuracy, as his German counterpart. The Germans had refused to believe that such a weapon could be mass-produced, that it could be reliable, that it could be placed in the hands of every common soldier. But disbelief doesn't stop bullets. And by the time the Wehrmacht realized what they were facing, the M1 Garand was already rewriting the rules of infantry combat, one 8-round clip at a time. For Private First Class Robert Leckie of the 1st Marine Division, the M1 Garand wasn't just a weapon, it was a lifeline. Leckie, who would later write one of the most visceral memoirs of the Pacific War, described the rifle with a kind of reverent pragmatism. It was heavy, yes, 9.5 pounds unloaded, closer to 10 with a full clip. It was long, over 43 inches from buttstock to muzzle. But when the shooting started, none of that mattered. What mattered was that you could keep firing. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, where visibility was measured in meters and ambushes came from every shadow, the ability to put multiple rounds on target without breaking your shooting position was the difference between living and dying. A Marine with a bolt-action Springfield had to pull his cheek off the stock, work the bolt, reacquire his target, and fire again. In that half-second of vulnerability, the enemy could move, return fire, or close the distance. A Marine with an M1 stayed on target, pulled the trigger, pulled it again, and again, until the threat stopped moving or the clip pinged out. The en-bloc clip system, 8 rounds loaded from the top in a single metal frame, was brilliantly simple. No fumbling with individual cartridges, no topping off magazines under fire. You burned through 8 rounds, the empty clip ejected itself with that distinctive metallic ping, and you slapped in a fresh one. In training, soldiers could reload in under 3 seconds. In combat, adrenaline made it faster. Some criticized the ping. They said it told the enemy you were empty, invited them to rush your position. But veterans dismissed this as a myth born from peacetime theorizing. In the noise and chaos of a firefight, explosions, screaming, machine guns hammering, artillery raining down, no enemy soldier was calmly listening for the delicate sound of an en-bloc clip ejecting 30 meters away. And even if they did hear it, even if they tried to rush, you had already reloaded. The M1 also had another advantage that statistics couldn't capture: confidence. Soldiers who carried bolt-action rifles had to make every shot count. Ammunition discipline was drilled into them. Slow, aimed fire, conserve your rounds, make them last. It was sound doctrine in many contexts, but it also bred hesitation. In close combat, hesitation kills. The M1 Garand allowed aggression. It allowed a rifleman to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, to suppress an enemy position while maneuvering, to lay down covering fire that felt, to both the shooter and the enemy, like something more than just a rifle. American infantry doctrine evolved around this capability: fire and movement, aggressive patrolling, the confidence to close with the enemy because you had the firepower to win the fight when you got there. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt of the 352nd Infantry Division had been in the Wehrmacht since 1940. He had fought in France, survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front, and by June 1944 found himself dug into the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach. He had seen combat. He knew how to fight. He knew the sound of war. But nothing prepared him for D-Day. When the Americans came ashore on the morning of June 6th, Schmidt and his comrades opened fire from fortified positions with interlocking fields of fire. MG-42s tore into the landing craft. Mortars rained down. The first waves were slaughtered. For a few hours, it seemed the invasion might be stopped at the waterline. Then the Americans who survived the beach began to move inland. Schmidt later recalled in a post-war interview the moment he realized something was wrong. His squad was holding a hedgerow position near Colville-sur-Mer. They had clear sight lines, good cover, an MG-42 team on the flank. They were confident. Then American infantry appeared across the field, maybe 70 meters away, and the firing started. It wasn't the disciplined, measured fire Schmidt was used to from the Soviets or the British. It was a storm. 8, 10, 12 rifles all firing in rapid succession. Not spraying wildly, aimed shots, hitting the hedgerow, forcing the Germans to stay down. Schmidt tried to return fire with his Kar 98K, but every time he raised his head another bullet cracked past. He worked his bolt, aimed, fired, worked the bolt again, aimed. Another burst of incoming fire drove him back into cover. The Americans advanced under their own rifle fire. No pause, no lull, just continuous, aggressive shooting that kept the Germans suppressed long enough for the GIs to close the distance. By the time Schmidt's squad tried to reposition, the Americans were already in grenade range. He survived that day. But the lesson stayed with him. The Americans could shoot faster than you could think. The numbers told a brutal story. A trained rifleman with a Kar 98Ka could maintain an effective rate of fire of around 10 to 15 rounds per minute in combat conditions. This assumed he was calm, well-practiced, and not under heavy fire. In reality, stress, fatigue, and suppression often reduced that rate significantly. A trained American soldier with an M1 Garand could maintain an effective rate of 30 to 40 rounds per minute. Some sources documented rates as high as 50 rounds per minute in short bursts, though this wasn't sustainable over long engagements. The difference wasn't just numerical, it was tactical. In a defensive position, a squad of 8 Americans with M1s could generate as much rifle fire as a German squad twice their size. This allowed American units to hold ground with fewer men or to mass firepower at critical points without needing additional support. In offensive operations, the M1's firepower enabled fire and movement tactics that were previously only possible with dedicated automatic weapons. Consider a standard infantry assault. A German squad advancing on an enemy position would rely on their MG-34 or MG-42 to suppress the defenders while riflemen maneuvered. The machine gun was the center of gravity. If the gunner went down, if the weapon jammed, the entire squad lost its offensive punch. An American squad could split into fire teams. 4 men with M1s could lay down suppressive fire, enough to keep enemy heads down, while the other 4 advanced. Then they switched roles. Leapfrog, bound by bound, with continuous fire throughout the movement. No single point of failure. No reliance on one gunner and one gun. German tactical manuals, updated throughout 1943 and 1944, began emphasizing the need to neutralize American riflemen as priority targets, something previously reserved for machine gunners and officers. The M1 had elevated the individual American soldier from a supporting element to a direct threat. John Cantius Garand was not a soldier. He was not a general or a tactician. He was a quiet, methodical engineer who understood that the difference between a good idea and a great weapon lay in the details. And the M1 Garand was a masterpiece of practical engineering. At its heart, the rifle operated on a gas system. When a round was fired, a portion of the expanding gas was diverted through a port in the barrel, roughly 6 inches from the muzzle. This gas pushed against a piston, which drove an operating rod backward. The operating rod rotated and unlocked the bolt, extracted the spent casing, ejected it, and then, driven by a carefully calibrated spring, returned forward, stripping a fresh round from the end-block clip and chambering it. The bolt locked. The rifle was ready to fire again. All of this happened in a fraction of a second, and it happened reliably, thousands of times, in mud, sand, rain, snow, and heat. Garand's genius was in the simplicity. Unlike other semi-automatic designs that used complex mechanisms with dozens of small parts, the M1 had fewer than 50 components. It could be field-stripped by a soldier with basic training in under 2 minutes. The gas system was self-regulating. It didn't require manual adjustment for different ammunition loads or environmental conditions. The rotating bolt was robust, locking into the receiver with multiple lugs that distributed stress evenly and prevented catastrophic failures. But simplicity alone wasn't enough. The rifle also had to be accurate. The M1's barrel was forged from high-quality carbon steel and rifled with 4 grooves in a right-hand twist. Effective range was listed at 500 yards, but skilled marksmen could hit man-sized targets well beyond that. The sights, a rear aperture and a front post, were intuitive and quick to acquire. The trigger, while not match-grade, was crisp enough for precision shooting and consistent enough for rapid fire. Perhaps most impressively, the rifle was designed for mass production. Garand worked closely with engineers at Springfield Armory and later Winchester to ensure that every part could be manufactured on standard industrial equipment. Tolerances were tight enough to ensure reliability, but loose enough to allow interchangeability. A bolt from one rifle could be swapped into another. A trigger group from a Springfield-made M1 would fit perfectly into a Winchester-made receiver. By 1945, over 4 million M1 Garands had been produced. 4 million nearly identical rifles, each one capable of the same performance, built in factories across the United States and shipped to every theater of the war. It was, in every sense, a weapon built for total war. General George S. Patton, Jr. was not a man given to understatement. Brash, aggressive, and unapologetically confident, Patton had strong opinions about everything from tank tactics to the proper shine on a soldier's boots. But when it came to the M1 Garand, his praise was unequivocal. He called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton understood something that many peacetime theorists did not. Firepower wins firefights, and firefights win battles. The side that can put more accurate rounds on target faster has an overwhelming advantage. The M1 Garand gave American infantry that advantage at the squad level, where most combat actually happened. Patton's Third Army, slashing across France in the summer of 1944, relied on speed and aggression. His armored spearheads were legendary, but it was the infantry, the men who dismounted from trucks and half-tracks, who cleared towns and held ground, who made the rapid advance possible. And those men carried M1 Garands. American infantry doctrine evolved to leverage the rifle's capabilities. The U.S. Army emphasized marksmanship, but not the slow, deliberate kind favored by some European militaries. American soldiers were trained to shoot fast and shoot accurately. They practiced rapid magazine changes, transition drills, and engaging multiple targets in quick succession. The doctrine was built around aggression, close with the enemy, bring superior firepower to bear, and win the fight. This wasn't just Patton's philosophy. It was embedded in field manuals, training programs, and the expectations of junior officers and NCOs. Squads were taught to move in bounds, with half the unit always firing while the other half maneuvered. The M1 made this possible without needing to rely solely on the BAR or machine guns for suppressive fire. Other Allied commanders took note. British officers, initially skeptical of the American reliance on semi-automatic rifles, began to reconsider after joint operations in North Africa and Italy. The British Army had long prided itself on disciplined, aimed fire with the Lee Enfield, but even the fast bolt of the Enfield couldn't match the sustained rate of fire from an M1. Some British units requested M1s for issue to their own troops, though logistical constraints and national pride generally kept the Lee Enfield in British hands. The Soviets, too, observed the American rifle with interest. They had fielded their own semi-automatics, the SVT-38 and SVT-40, but production issues, reliability problems in harsh conditions, and a lack of trained armorers meant these rifles never achieved widespread use. By 1943, the Soviets had largely reverted to the Mosin Nagant for standard infantry, reserving semi-automatics for specialists. Watching American infantry in action during link-ups in Germany in 1945, Soviet officers noted the effectiveness of universal semi-automatic issue. The lesson was clear. Equipping every soldier with a semi-automatic rifle wasn't just possible, it was a decisive advantage. No weapon is perfect. And despite its revolutionary impact, the M1 Garand had flaws, some real, some exaggerated into legend. The most famous criticism was the en-bloc clip's distinctive ping when it ejected. Detractors claimed this sound alerted the enemy that the shooter was empty, creating a vulnerability. In reality, as previously noted, the noise of battle made this a non-issue. Firefights aren't quiet, controlled affairs where soldiers listen for specific audio cues. They're chaotic, deafening, and overwhelming. The ping was audible to the shooter, and perhaps soldiers immediately next to him, but it was irrelevant to an enemy under fire. A more legitimate concern was the inability to top off the magazine. The en-bloc clip held 8 rounds, and once inserted, it stayed in the rifle until all 8 were fired. Unlike a detachable box magazine, you couldn't eject a partially spent clip and insert a fresh one without wasting ammunition. This meant a soldier who fired 3 rounds and wanted a full reload had to manually eject the clip, wasting 5 good cartridges, or continue with only 5 rounds remaining. In practice, experienced soldiers learned to manage this. They kept mental counts of their shots. They reloaded during lulls in the fighting. And in sustained engagements, 8 rounds went fast enough that partial reloads were rarely an issue. Weight was another complaint. At nearly 10 pounds loaded, the M1 was heavier than the Kar 98K or the Lee Enfield. For soldiers humping through jungles, mountains, or across French hedgerows, every ounce mattered. But the weight was a trade-off for durability and the gas system's robust construction. Soldiers griped, but they also knew the rifle would work when they needed it. Accuracy at extreme range was occasionally questioned. The M1 was not a sniper rifle. It was a battle rifle, designed for effective fire out to 500 yards. Beyond that, specialized weapons like the Springfield 1903 with a scope were preferred. But battles are rarely won at 800 yards. They're won at 100, 200, maybe 300 yards, where the M1 excelled. Perhaps the most important reality was this. The M1 Garand was not invincible, and it did not guarantee victory. American soldiers still died. They still lost firefights. They still faced determined enemies with superior positions or overwhelming numbers. The rifle was a tool, not a magic wand. But it was the best tool of its kind in the world, and in the hands of well-trained, aggressive infantry, it gave the Americans an edge that the Wehrmacht could not match. June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, 0630 hours. The ramps dropped and hell opened its mouth. Men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stumbled into chest-deep water, weighed down by 60 pounds of gear. M1 Garands held high to keep them dry. German machine guns, MG-42s firing from concrete bunkers and cliff positions, raked the beach at 1,200 rounds per minute. Mortar shells exploded in the surf. Artillery airbursts showered steel fragments. The first waves were cut down before they reached the sand. Bodies floated in the tide. Wounded men drowned in 3 feet of water. For hours it looked like the invasion would fail at the waterline. But some men made it across the beach. Some men found cover behind the seawall, behind disabled tanks, behind the bodies of their friends. And those men, soaking wet, terrified but alive, still had their rifles. Staff Sergeant Raymond Hoback of the 29th Infantry Division crouched behind a wooden obstacle, seawater draining from his boots. Around him, men were frozen, pinned by machine gun fire, unable to move forward, unwilling to retreat into the killing zone behind them. Officers were dead or wounded. Radio communications were chaos. The carefully rehearsed plan had disintegrated in the first 10 minutes. Hoback looked at the cliffs, looked at the bunkers spitting fire, looked at the men around him. Then he stood up and started shooting. Not blindly, not in panic. He aimed at the nearest bunker aperture, maybe 150 yards upslope, and fired. Worked the trigger as fast as he could acquire each shot, 8 rounds in rapid succession. The en-bloc clip pinged out. He reloaded, still standing, and fired again. Other soldiers, seeing him, began to do the same. M1s cracked in a stuttering chorus. They couldn't knock out the bunkers. Concrete doesn't care about rifle bullets. But they could suppress them. Force the German gunners to duck. Create a window. And in that window, men started moving. This scene repeated itself across Omaha Beach that morning. Small groups of soldiers, squad leaders, sergeants, privates who simply refused to die on the sand, using their M1 Garands to generate enough fire to suppress German positions long enough to advance. They moved in bounds. Fire and movement. The doctrine they'd trained for in England, now executed under the most horrific conditions imaginable. By mid-morning, American infantry had breached the seawall in multiple locations. By afternoon, they were climbing the bluffs. By nightfall, the 1st and 29th Divisions had secured a tenuous foothold. The cost was staggering, over 2,000 casualties on Omaha alone. But they had won the beach. German defenders, interrogated in the days that followed, described the American rifle fire as relentless. One Obergefreiter from the 352nd Infantry Division stated in a captured diary that the Americans shoot like they have endless ammunition. Another noted that attempting to return fire from bunker apertures became suicidal. As soon as you show yourself, 10 rifles answer. The M1 Garand had not won D-Day by itself. Artillery, naval gunfire, air support, and raw courage carried the day. But in the critical hours when everything hung in balance, when survival depended on small unit actions by terrified men on a blood-soaked beach, the rifle gave American soldiers the firepower to fight back. 3 months later. August 1944. The Falaise Pocket. The German 7th Army was collapsing. Surrounded by American, British, and Canadian forces in Normandy, tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers attempted to escape eastward through a narrow corridor near the town of Falaise. It was a slaughter. Allied artillery and air power pounded the retreating columns. The roads became graveyards of destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned equipment. But not all the killing was done at a distance. American infantry from the 90th Infantry Division established blocking positions along the roads leading out of the pocket. Their mission was simple: stop any Germans trying to break through. The Wehrmacht, desperate and still dangerous, launched repeated attacks to punch through the encirclement. Private First Class John Bistrica of Company F, 359th Infantry Regiment, was positioned in a hedgerow overlooking a small crossroads. His squad, 8 men with M1 Garands and 1 bar, had orders to hold the position at all costs. At dawn on August 19th, German infantry appeared on the road. Not a probing patrol. A full company, maybe more, advancing in squad columns with covering fire from MG-42 teams. Bistrica's squad opened fire, 8 M1s firing in coordinated volleys. The Americans didn't shoot wildly. They picked targets, fired, shifted to the next target, fired again. The bar gunner focused on the German machine gun positions, forcing them to displace. The riflemen engaged the infantry, dropping men at 100-150 yards. The Germans tried to rush the hedgerow, but American fire was too intense. They tried to flank, but the squad shifted positions within the hedgerow, maintaining overlapping fields of fire. The firefight lasted nearly 30 minutes. When it ended, the German attack had been shattered. Bodies lay scattered on the road. Survivors retreated back toward the pocket. Bistrica's squad had expended over 400 rounds of .30-06 ammunition, an average of 50 rounds per man. None of them had been hit. A German lieutenant, captured later that day, was asked why his company failed to take the crossroads. He replied bitterly, "We thought we were attacking a machine gun position. It was 8 men with rifles." This was the climax of the M1 Garand's impact on the war. Not a single dramatic moment, but thousands of small, vicious engagements where American infantry, often outnumbered and sometimes outmaneuvered, could generate enough firepower to hold the line or seize the initiative. The rifle had become a force multiplier in the truest sense. making each American soldier worth 2, sometimes 3, of his opponents in a straight-up firefight. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last gamble in the West. 25 German divisions smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, seeking to split the Allied armies and recapture the port of Antwerp. In the first days of the offensive, entire American regiments were surrounded, outflanked, or overrun. German armor spearheaded deep into Belgium. The weather grounded Allied air power. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as though the Wehrmacht might achieve a strategic breakthrough. But the Germans had miscalculated. They had assumed American infantry would break under pressure, that Green divisions would panic and retreat. They were wrong. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division dug in and held against overwhelming odds. At St. Vith, the 7th Armored Division and attached infantry delayed German advances for days, buying critical time. At dozens of unnamed crossroads and small towns, American rifle companies stood and fought, and they fought with M1 Garands. In the frozen forests around Bastogne, visibility was often measured in yards. Engagements happened at point-blank range. German Volksgrenadier divisions, newly raised units with a mix of veterans and green recruits, pressed attacks in dense formations, hoping to overwhelm American positions through sheer numbers. They walked into a buzzsaw. American perimeter defenses, even when surrounded, maintained devastating volumes of rifle fire. Squads positioned in hasty foxholes could engage multiple German assault waves without needing to rely entirely on crew-served weapons. The M1's semi-automatic fire meant that even when outnumbered, American soldiers could create enough bullets in the air to break up attacks before they reached friendly lines. Technical Sergeant Paul Matz of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment described one engagement outside Bastogne. They came at us in waves. We just kept shooting. You didn't think. You didn't count rounds. You just fired until the clip pinged, reloaded, and fired again. There were so many of them, but we put so much fire downrange that they couldn't get close. The Germans adapted. They increased their use of infiltration tactics, night attacks, and concentrated artillery. But the fundamental problem remained. In a direct firefight, American infantry could outshoot them. The turning point wasn't a single battle. It was a realization that spread through the Wehrmacht like a slow, corrosive poison. We cannot win firefights on equal terms. By early 1945, German tactical doctrine had fundamentally shifted in response to American firepower. Field manuals and after-action reports from every front where German and American forces clashed showed the same adaptations. Avoid prolonged engagements. Use terrain ruthlessly. Maximize the effectiveness of machine guns and Panzerfausts. Rely on prepared defenses, not maneuver. And above all, do not let American infantry close to medium range with clear fields of fire. But wars are not won by avoiding contact, and as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, avoidance became impossible. In the Hurtgen Forest, a nightmarish stretch of dense woodland along the German-Belgian border, American and German forces fought a savage, grinding battle from September 1944 through February 1945. The forest was a defender's paradise. Thick trees, limited visibility, narrow trails, and pre-registered German artillery that could devastate any position within minutes. American advances were measured in yards per day. Casualties were horrific on both sides. But even in the Hurtgen, where every advantage favored the defender, the M1 Garand proved its worth. Corporal Edward Wilken of the 4th Infantry Division fought through the forest in November 1944. His platoon was tasked with clearing a fortified German position, bunkers, trenches, and interlocking machine gun nests. Standard assault doctrine called for suppressive fire from mortars and machine guns while infantry maneuvered. But in the dense forest, mortar rounds often exploded in the canopy, and machine guns had limited fields of fire. So the riflemen did it themselves. Wilken's squad moved in a staggered line, each man within visual contact of the next. When they spotted a German position, they didn't wait for support. They opened fire immediately, 8 M1s hammering the target with rapid aimed shots. The Germans returned fire, but the sheer volume of incoming rounds forced them to stay low, disrupting their ability to coordinate a defense. While half the squad kept shooting, the other half bounded forward. Then they switched. It was slow. It was exhausting. And it worked. The Germans couldn't maintain effective return fire under that kind of pressure. Their Kar-98s required them to expose themselves to work the bolt, to aim, to fire. Every time they did, American bullets were already in the air. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical. German soldiers in the Hurtgen later reported feeling hunted, constantly under fire, unable to fight back effectively, watching their positions slowly overrun by an enemy that never seemed to stop shooting. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the Wehrmacht was a broken force. Manpower shortages, fuel shortages, collapsing logistics, and relentless Allied air superiority had crippled German combat effectiveness. But even in retreat, even in the final desperate days, German soldiers still carried Kar-98s. They still fought, they still tried, and they still lost firefights to American infantry. In the ruins of German cities, Cologne, Aachen, Nuremberg, urban combat became the norm. Buildings became fortresses, every window a firing position, every street a kill zone. German defenders, many of them old men from Volkssturm militia units or teenage boys from Hitler Youth formations, held positions with fanatical determination. The Americans cleared them out with grenades, flamethrowers, tank support, and M1 Garands. Urban warfare is intimate, brutal. A rifleman kicks down a door, enters a room, and has maybe 2 seconds to identify threats and engage. In that environment, the M1's semi-automatic fire was a godsend. A soldier could engage multiple enemies in quick succession without needing to work a bolt in cramped quarters. Room to room, floor to floor, the Americans pressed forward, and the rifle that had proven itself on beaches, in forests, and across open fields now proved itself in the shattered bones of the Third Reich. Lieutenant Joseph Dawson of the 16th Infantry Regiment led his platoon through the streets of Aachen in October 1944. He later described the advantage the M1 provided in close combat. You go through a doorway, you don't know what's on the other side. Maybe nothing. Maybe 3 Germans with rifles. If you've got a bolt gun, you better make that first shot count because you won't get a second. With the Garand, you can put 3, 4, 5 rounds into a room in 2 seconds. It's the difference between walking out or getting carried out. German soldiers, when they surrendered, often asked to see the American rifles. Some had heard rumors that the U.S. had equipped every soldier with automatic weapons. When shown the M1, they were incredulous. "This is not automatic?" one captured grenadier asked. "How do you fire so fast?" The answer was simple. They didn't have to stop shooting to reload the next round. The statistics, compiled after the war, told the story in cold numbers. U.S. Army Ordnance Studies estimated that American infantrymen fired an average of 30% more rounds per engagement than their German counterparts. This wasn't because Americans were wasteful or poorly disciplined. It was because they could. The M1 allowed a rate of fire that bolt-action rifles simply couldn't match. Casualty exchange rates in infantry engagements, when controlling for factors like artillery, air support, and defensive positions, favored American forces by approximately 1.3 to 1. For every American rifleman killed or wounded in a firefight, roughly 1.3 German soldiers became casualties. This wasn't overwhelming dominance, but in the aggregate, across thousands of engagements, it was decisive. German divisional reports from late 1944 and early 1945 repeatedly cited American small arms fire as a major impediment to effective counterattacks. One report from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division noted, "Enemy rifle fire is of such intensity that maneuver under fire is extremely difficult. Attacks stall under weight of fire before reaching assault distance." Another report from the 2nd Panzer Division after engagements in the Ardennes stated bluntly, "American infantry squads possess firepower equivalent to our own platoons. Without significant machine gun or armor support, our infantry cannot achieve local superiority." The Wehrmacht had built its doctrine around the primacy of the machine gun. The MG-34 and MG-42 were phenomenal weapons, perhaps the best machine guns of the war. But doctrine and reality had diverged. When American squads could generate rifle fire that rivaled light machine guns, the German tactical advantage evaporated. And there was no fix. Germany couldn't retool its entire small arms industry in the middle of a losing war. They experimented with semi-automatic rifles, the Gewehr 41, the Gewehr 43. But production numbers were a fraction of what was needed. By 1945, the Wehrmacht was issuing more Panzerfausts, disposable anti-tank weapons, and Sturmgewehrs, assault rifles, to frontline units, because they recognized that their infantry couldn't compete with American firepower in conventional engagements. The M1 Garand hadn't just outperformed the Kar 98K. It had forced the enemy to change how they fought, and ultimately to accept that they couldn't win. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the Pacific, the war continued until August, with Marines and Army infantry carrying M1 Garands through the hell of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and 1,000 smaller islands. But the rifle's impact on the European war was undeniable. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in Europe, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The M1 rifle was one of the most important weapons in our arsenal. It gave our infantrymen a decisive edge in firepower and confidence." General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was more succinct. "Our boys could shoot faster and more accurately than the Germans. That made all the difference in the close fights." And in the rubble of Berlin, in POW cages from Normandy to the Rhine, German soldiers who had survived the war carried with them a hard-earned respect for the weapon that had helped defeat them. They had refused to believe it was real, but the M1 Garand had been real, and it had unleashed hell. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the accountants began their work. Casualty figures, ammunition expenditure, equipment losses, the cold arithmetic of war, distilled into columns of numbers that tried, and always failed, to capture the human cost. The M1 Garand's impact appeared clearly in those numbers, even if the statistics could never fully explain the fear in a German soldier's eyes or the confidence in an American GI's hands. Between 1943 and 1945, the U.S. military produced over 4.2 million M1 Garand rifles. Nearly all of them reached frontline troops. This represented the largest deployment of semi-automatic rifles in military history. No other nation, not Germany, not the Soviet Union, not Britain, had equipped its entire infantry force with self-loading weapons. The Americans had done it, and they had done it at scale. Ammunition consumption told its own story. American infantry divisions in the European theater expended an average of 12,000 rounds of .30-06 rifle ammunition per day during active operations. This was roughly 40% higher than comparable German divisions firing 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser ammunition from their Kar 98KS. The difference wasn't waste, it was capability. American soldiers could afford to shoot more because their rifles allowed them to shoot more effectively. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army's Operational Research Office examined thousands of combat after-action reports. Their findings were striking. In infantry engagements where American and German forces were roughly equal in numbers and position, American units achieved tactical objectives 68% of the time. When artillery and air support were factored out, isolating pure infantry versus infantry engagements, the success rate remained above 60%. The study identified three primary factors: superior American logistics, aggressive tactical doctrine, and individual firepower superiority. The M1 Garand was central to that third factor. German casualties reflected this reality. Wehrmacht divisions that fought primarily against American forces in France, Belgium, and Germany suffered higher rates of rifle-inflicted wounds compared to divisions fighting the British or Soviets. Medical reports from German field hospitals noted an increase in multiple gunshot wounds per casualty. Soldiers hit 2, 3, sometimes 4 times in a single engagement. This pattern was consistent with facing rapid semi-automatic fire rather than slower bolt-action rifles. One German medical officer, captured in April 1945, described treating wounded soldiers from the Western Front. "We see patterns we did not see in Russia. More wounds per man. Tighter shot groupings. The Americans shoot very fast, very accurately. Our men cannot return fire quickly enough." But the aftermath wasn't only measured in blood and bullets. It was measured in minds. Psychological studies conducted on German prisoners of war revealed a consistent pattern of respect and fear regarding American small arms. When asked to identify the most dangerous aspects of fighting American infantry, German soldiers ranked U.S. rifle fire surprisingly high, often above artillery or tanks. This seemed counterintuitive at first. Artillery killed more men. Tanks were more devastating. But rifle fire was personal, immediate, and unrelenting. A Feldwebel from the 277th Volksgrenadier Division, interrogated in March 1945, put it bluntly, "You can hide from artillery, you can avoid tanks, but the American rifleman is everywhere, and he never stops shooting." This psychological dimension had strategic implications. By late 1944, Wehrmacht units showed increasing reluctance to engage American infantry in open terrain. German commanders noted declining offensive spirit, slower counterattacks, and a preference for static defense over maneuver. Some of this was due to overall German decline, exhaustion, shortages, collapsing morale. But interrogations and captured documents repeatedly cited American firepower as a specific deterrent. One captured order from a German regimental commander in the Ardennes read, "Under no circumstances are companies to attempt frontal assaults against American positions without overwhelming machine gun and armor support. American rifle fire is too intense for unsupported infantry attacks." This represented a fundamental shift. The Wehrmacht, which had pioneered modern combined arms warfare and prided itself on tactical flexibility, was now advising its troops to avoid direct infantry confrontations with an enemy they once considered soft and inexperienced. American soldiers, for their part, developed an almost familial bond with their rifles. Letters home from the front frequently mentioned the M1, not in technical terms, but in personal ones. Soldiers gave their rifles nicknames. They cleaned them obsessively, even in lulls between combat. They trusted them in a way soldiers rarely trust equipment. The rifle had kept them alive, and they knew it. Private First Class Roscoe Blunt of the 2nd Infantry Division wrote to his brother in January 1945, "I don't know where I'd be without this rifle. Maybe dead, maybe captured. It's the one thing I can count on when everything else goes to hell. I take care of it, and it takes care of me." This wasn't sentimentality. It was pragmatic recognition of a tool that worked. Soldiers who had experienced jammed weapons, misfires, or equipment failures in training understood how rare it was to have a rifle that simply functioned every time, under the worst conditions imaginable. Maintenance records from U.S. ordnance companies showed remarkably low failure rates for the M1. Even after months of continuous field use, through rain, mud, sand, and snow, the rifles required minimal repair. Broken firing pins and worn springs were occasional issues, but catastrophic failures were rare. Armorer reports from the European theater indicated that less than 2% of M1 Garands in service required depot-level repair during the entire campaign from D-Day to VE Day. Compare that to the German Gewehr 43, their attempted answer to the M1. The G43 was a capable semi-automatic rifle, but it was plagued by reliability issues. Gas systems fouled easily. Parts broke under sustained use. German armorer reports from 1944 showed failure rates above 15% for G43s in frontline service. Production never exceeded 400,000 units, and many were pulled from service and replaced with Kar 98KS because they couldn't be kept operational. The Soviets faced similar problems with their SVT-40. While theoretically a good design, the rifle required trained armorers and careful maintenance, luxuries the Red Army couldn't afford. By 1943, the Soviets had largely abandoned the SVT-40 in favor of the simpler, more rugged Mosin Nagant and the PPSH-41 submachine gun. Only the Americans had succeeded in fielding a semi-automatic rifle that worked reliably at scale. And that success had tangible battlefield consequences. The lessons learned from the M1 Garand's battlefield dominance rippled outward, reshaping military thinking across the globe. Within months of Germany's surrender, military observers from Allied and neutral nations began studying American infantry tactics and equipment. The British, despite their pride in the venerable Lee Enfield, initiated studies on adopting semi-automatic rifles for future conflicts. The Canadians, who had fought alongside American units throughout the war, formally requested surplus M1 Garands for their own forces. The French, rebuilding their military from the ashes of occupation, adopted the M1 as a stopgap measure while developing indigenous designs. Even the Soviets, who rarely acknowledged Western military superiority, took note. Post-war Soviet small arms development shifted decisively toward semi-automatic and selective fire weapons. The SKS carbine, adopted in 1945, was a direct response to lessons learned fighting the Germans. But Soviet military analysts had also studied American use of the M1 through intelligence reports and observation of joint operations in Germany. The famous AK-47, developed by Mikhail Kalashnikov and adopted in 1947, represented the next evolution. A weapon that combined semi-automatic capability with fully automatic fire, fed from a detachable magazine. The age of the bolt-action service rifle was over. The M1 Garand had proven that conclusively. But perhaps the most important aftermath played out not in design bureaus or military academies, but in the memories of the men who had fought. German veterans in the decades following the war spoke with surprising candor about their American adversaries. In interviews, memoirs, and historical studies, a consistent theme emerged: respect. Not for American generalship, which many German officers considered pedestrian, not for American tactical flexibility, which they often criticized, but for American firepower, and specifically for the rifle. Fritz Langanke, a former Obergefreiter in the 352nd Infantry Division who survived Normandy and fought through the Bulge, said in a 1978 interview, "We were told the Americans were not serious soldiers, that they relied on machines and numbers, not skill. But when you are in a foxhole and the bullets are coming faster than you can count, you realize skill means nothing if you cannot shoot back. They could shoot back. We could not match them." Another veteran, Otto Carius, a decorated German tank ace who also fought as infantry in the war's final months, wrote in his memoir, "The American soldier was better equipped than we were. That's not taking anything away from our men. We fought hard. But their rifle, that rifle made every American dangerous." This wasn't the grudging admission of the defeated. It was the sober assessment of men who had survived the worst combat of the 20th century and understood, with the clarity that only hindsight and peace can bring, what had beaten them. The M1 Garand service didn't end in 1945. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, American soldiers once again carried M1 Garands into combat. And once again, the rifle proved its worth. Chinese and North Korean forces, many equipped with bolt-action rifles or obsolete semi-automatics, faced the same firepower disadvantage that the Wehrmacht had encountered a decade earlier. American infantry, often outnumbered, used their superior rate of fire to hold defensive positions and break up human wave attacks. At the Battle of Chosin Reservoir in November 1950, Marines and Army soldiers fought in temperatures dropping to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. Weapons froze. Equipment failed. Men died from exposure as often as from enemy fire. But the M1 Garand, designed with enough tolerance to function in extreme conditions, kept working. Marines who survived the breakout from Chosin credited their rifles with saving their lives, allowing them to maintain defensive fire even when outnumbered 10-1. The rifle remained in frontline U.S. service until 1957, when it was gradually replaced by the M14, a weapon that was essentially an updated M1 with a detachable 20-round magazine and selective fire capability. Even then, M1 Garands remained in reserve stocks with National Guard units and in the hands of allied nations for decades. The rifle saw combat in Vietnam with South Vietnamese forces. It served with Greek, Turkish, and Italian armies through the Cold War. It armed Philippine soldiers, Ethiopian troops, and dozens of other nations who received American military aid. Some M1 Garands remain in service today with ceremonial units and reserve forces around the world. By any measure, it was one of the most successful military rifles in history. The numbers, compiled over decades of analysis, supported this assessment with brutal clarity. Over 6.5 million M1 Garands were produced between 1936 and 1957. The rifle served in every theater of World War II, Korea, and numerous smaller conflicts. Millions of soldiers, American, Allied, and foreign, trained on it, carried it, and trusted their lives to it. Studies conducted by the U.S. Army's Combat Studies Institute estimated that the M1 Garand increased effective infantry firepower by 40 to 50% compared to bolt-action equivalents. This wasn't just theoretical, it translated directly into battlefield outcomes. Engagements won, positions held, lives saved. The rifle's influence on military doctrine was equally profound. The American emphasis on firepower, aggressive tactics, and well-equipped infantry became the model for Western military thinking throughout the Cold War. The concept that every soldier should have access to rapid, accurate fire, not just specialists or machine gunners, became standard. Modern infantry weapons, from the M16 to the M4 carbine, are direct descendants of the philosophy that John Garand's rifle embodied. But beyond doctrine, beyond statistics, beyond the cold calculus of military effectiveness, the M1 Garand represented something more fundamental: the democratization of firepower. Before the M1, infantry combat was defined by hierarchy. The machine gun was king. Riflemen supported the gunner. The squad's effectiveness depended on one man, one weapon, one critical point of failure. If the machine gunner fell, the squad lost its offensive capability. The M1 Garand changed that. It elevated every rifleman, made every soldier a potential force multiplier. An American infantry squad wasn't built around a single weapon. It was built around 8 capable shooters, any of whom could suppress an enemy position, break up an attack, or cover a withdrawal. This had psychological implications that extended beyond the battlefield. American soldiers weren't just cogs in a machine. They were empowered individuals with the tools to fight effectively. This aligned with broader American values: individualism, self-reliance, the belief that one person, properly equipped and trained, could make a difference. German soldiers, coming from a more hierarchical military tradition where the machine gun dominated tactics, found this disconcerting. The Americans fought differently, not better in every respect. German tactical doctrine, leadership, and combined arms coordination were often superior in the war's early years, but differently in a way that was difficult to counter. You couldn't kill the American squad's firepower by taking out one man. You had to suppress or eliminate the entire squad, and that required resources: machine guns, artillery, overwhelming numbers, that the Wehrmacht, by 1944, increasingly didn't have. The M1 Garand didn't win World War II. No single weapon ever does, but it gave American infantry an edge, tangible, measurable, undeniable, that accumulated across thousands of firefights into strategic advantage. And when the Wehrmacht finally understood what they were facing, it was already too late. There is a photograph, taken somewhere in Germany in the spring of 1945. An American soldier sits on the rubble of a destroyed building, his M1 Garand resting across his knees. His uniform is filthy. His face is exhausted, but he is alive. And the rifle in his hands is clean, oiled, ready. Behind him, smoke rises from a shattered city. Around him, the debris of a fallen empire. War is decided by many things: strategy, logistics, leadership, morale, the courage of men who walk into fire because someone told them to. But it is also decided by tools, by the simple mechanical advantage of one piece of steel and wood over another, by the ability to shoot faster, more accurately, more reliably than the enemy across the field. The M1 Garand was such a tool. It didn't make American soldiers invincible. It didn't guarantee victory in every firefight, but it gave them an edge, a small, quantifiable superiority that, multiplied across millions of soldiers and thousands of battles, helped tip the balance of the most destructive war in human history. The Germans refused to believe it was real because it challenged their assumptions. They believed their infantry was superior. They believed their doctrine was sound. They believed bolt-action rifles were sufficient. And for a time, those beliefs held. But belief, no matter how strong, cannot stop bullets. And when reality arrived in the form of 8 rapid shots fired by a 19-year-old farm boy from Iowa, belief shattered like glass. Technology doesn't determine history, but it shapes it. The M1 Garand shaped the Second World War in ways subtle and profound. It changed how infantry fought. It forced enemies to adapt or die. It gave one generation of soldiers the tools they needed to survive and sometimes to prevail. And when the war ended, when the last shot was fired and the rifles were finally stacked in armories and warehouses, those soldiers remembered. They remembered the weight of the weapon, the sound of the en-bloc clip ejecting, the confidence it gave them when everything else was chaos and terror. They remembered that when hell came, the M1 Garand had been there, ready, reliable, real. and that made all the difference.